Corporal Anton Faust sprinted roughly 90 yards across the bridge approach at Remagen under a storm of American rifle fire. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to blow the bridge up before the enemy reached it. He had volunteered for this. He made it to the primer cord. He lit it by hand and ran back toward the tunnel. There was a tremendous blast. The great steel span shook. It lifted slightly in the air. And then it settled back down, perfectly intact, still spanning the Rhine River in western Germany, still connecting the town of Remagen on one bank to Erpel on the other. The Americans were already running across. In the days and weeks that followed, American engineer soldiers built bridge after bridge over the Rhine so quickly that German commanders could not process what they were seeing. 4 officers were executed by a single shot to the back of the neck for failing to stop it. The head of German propaganda described the situation as nearly catastrophic. The last natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany, a river that no foreign army had successfully forced in wartime for well over a century, had been pierced so fast and so completely that the war in the West was effectively decided in under 3 weeks. This is the story of how the Americans did it, why the Germans feared and hated every bridge that went up, and what the crossing of the Rhine in March of 1945 tells us about 2 armies at the absolute limit of what war demands. To understand what the Rhine meant to Germany in the spring of 1945, you have to understand how desperate the situation had already become. By the first days of March, the Western Allies had reached the river along most of its length after 9 months of continuous fighting from the beaches of Normandy. The Americans had crossed France and Belgium and Luxembourg and most of Western Germany. The British and Canadians had pushed through the Netherlands. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from the east. Germany was a country being compressed from every direction at once, with no reserve formations left capable of mounting a sustained defense anywhere along the front. The Rhine itself was a formidable military obstacle by any measure. It ran for over 1,200 kilometers across Central Europe. At the crossing points, the Allies would need to force. The river stretched more than 400 meters from bank to bank in most locations. It ran cold, fast, and deep. The current at Remagen reached nearly 8 kilometers per hour in early spring. Even at low water, the Rhine was completely unfordable for troops on foot and utterly impassable for armored vehicles without bridging. The cliffs and forested hills, rising steeply on the eastern bank, provided ideal positions for artillery observers and machine gun nests. No foreign army had successfully crossed the Rhine in wartime since the time of Napoleon, a fact that German commanders and American war correspondents alike repeated throughout March of 1945 as shorthand for what crossing the river would mean. Hitler was fully aware of what the river represented, both strategically and in the German national imagination. He issued precise orders governing the demolition of Rhine bridges. Explosives could only be placed when the enemy was confirmed within 8 kilometers of a bridge. They could only be fired on written orders from the designated authority. The policy originated from an embarrassing incident in October of 1944, when American bombs struck the demolition chamber of the Cologne-Mulheim Bridge, triggering the charges prematurely and denying German troops an escape route. The officers held responsible had been court-martialed. Hitler's correction was meant to prevent future hasty demolitions. What it produced instead was a complete paralysis of decision-making at every bridge along the river. German bridge commanders became trapped between 2 identical fates: blow the bridge before written authorization arrived and face a tribunal, fail to blow it in time and face the same tribunal with a different charge. In March of 1945, that paralysis would cost Germany the Rhine. For Germany, the Rhine was not merely a river. Since the time of the Roman legions, who had used it as the empire's eastern boundary, the Rhine had defined where Central Europe ended and the Germanic world began. Every major German strategic plan of the 19th and 20th centuries had incorporated the assumption that an enemy advancing from the west would eventually have to force it, and that forcing it would be extraordinarily costly. The German army had prepared river defense doctrine, trained its engineers in demolition procedures, and built the entire concept of the Western defensive line around the idea that the Rhine, properly defended, could bleed an attacker white. It was the deepest assumption in German military thinking on the Western Front. When it failed, it did not fail gradually. It failed in an afternoon. Of 22 road bridges and 25 railroad bridges that had spanned the Rhine at the start of the Western campaign, Only 4 were still standing by the first week of March, 1945. 3 of those 4 were destroyed by their own defenders in the days that followed. The 4th was the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The Ludendorff Bridge had been built between 1916 and 1919, constructed in large part by Russian prisoners of war to serve as a military supply route in the First World War. Its main steel structure measured 1,066 feet in length, with an overall span including approach ramps of roughly 1,300 feet. The bridge was named after the German general who had championed its construction. By March of 1945, German engineers had planked over its 2 rail lines with timber to allow vehicle traffic. 2 massive stone towers anchored the bridge at each end, giving it the appearance of a medieval fortress gateway. On the eastern bank, a dark basalt cliff called the helplessly rose approximately 450 feet above the river, and behind it a railway tunnel ran through solid rock for about 1,200 feet. In the weeks before the American advance reached the area, hundreds of civilians and German stragglers had taken shelter in that tunnel, believing it the safest place available. The German officer responsible for the immediate defense of the bridge on March 7th was Captain Willy Bratge. He had 36 men from a convalescent company under his command, most of them recovering from wounds and formally classified as unfit for frontline service. The technical engineer officer responsible for preparing and firing the demolition charges was Captain Karl Friesenhahn, who had roughly 125 men from a pioneer regiment assigned to Rhine bridge demolitions in the sector. Scattered through the surrounding area were groups of Hitler Youth, Luftwaffe, anti-aircraft crews, Eastern European volunteers who had been conscripted into German service, and Volkssturm militia. The total force in the vicinity numbered perhaps 1,000 men, but these were not a coherent fighting formation. They were the fragments of a collapsing army, held together by discipline, habit, and the very reasonable fear of what would happen if they stopped. Friesenhahn had requested 600 kilograms of military demolition explosive for the bridge charges. What he received, at 11 in the morning on March 7th, was 300 kilograms of a material called donerit, a commercially produced ammonium nitrate-based industrial explosive normally used in mining, considerably weaker than the military ordnance he had asked for. It was the only explosive available in the sector. He had no choice but to work with what he had. The officer sent from Corps headquarters to assume overall command of the Remagen bridge defense was Major Hans Scheller, an adjutant to the 67th Corps. He had been dispatched from 40 miles away at 1:20 in the morning on March 7th, 1945. He arrived at Remagen at 11:15 that morning. Less than 2 hours later, American reconnaissance scouts appeared on the ridge above the town. The force that spotted the bridge still standing was a task force from the 9th Armored Division of the United States First Army. The lead elements crested a wooded ridge north of Remagen and looked down at the Rhine below them. The bridge was there. It was intact. It was crowded with retreating German troops, civilians, horses and cattle, carts and military vehicles, all trying to reach the eastern bank before the Americans arrived. The scouts radioed what they had found. The report travelled up the chain of command within minutes. Brigadier General William Hogue, commanding Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, received it and ordered an immediate assault. Hogue understood exactly what he was looking at. He did not wait for authorization from higher headquarters. The infantry company that would lead the crossing was commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Karl Timmerman. He was 22 years old, born in Frankfurt am Main to an American soldier father and a German mother, raised in West Point, Nebraska. He had been given command of a company of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion just the previous evening, after his commander, Captain Frederick F. Kreiner, was wounded during the fighting at Oppenheim. He was inexperienced as a company commander. What he had was decisiveness, and the men around him had seen enough of it to trust him. The scene at Remagen in the early afternoon of March 7th was one of barely controlled chaos on both sides of the river. Thousands of German soldiers, civilians and animals were still pouring across the bridge in retreat. Friesenhahn's demolition crew was racing against an enemy they could see advancing down the hillside into the town. American tank crews were maneuvering for firing positions in the streets. The helplessly cliff loomed over everything on the eastern bank, its dark basalt face dotted with the muzzle flashes of German anti-aircraft guns turned against ground targets. Everyone at Remagen that afternoon understood that whatever happened in the next 20 minutes would matter for the rest of the war. As Timmerman's soldiers moved down through the streets of Remagen toward the bridge approach, American tanks and riflemen swept the bridge surface and the tower windows with covering fire. German soldiers on the bridge and in the towers fired back. At 2 in the afternoon, a preliminary explosive charge on the western approach ramp went off, blowing a 30-foot crater in the road intended to stop American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge. At 3:20, Captain Friesenhahn turned the electrical detonator for the main demolition charge. It failed to fire. The steel conduit carrying the detonation wires had been severed by American artillery fire in the preceding hours. With Timmerman's men already reaching the bridge entrance, Friesenhahn called for a volunteer to light the manual primer cord by hand. Corporal Anton Faust ran roughly 90 yards under fire across the bridge approach, lit the cord, and ran back to the tunnel. The explosion lifted the span, and then the bridge settled back onto its piers, intact. The Donnerit had not been powerful enough to cut the steel. The bridge stood. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a tall former butcher from Holland, Ohio, was the first American soldier to reach the eastern bank. He ran across the bridge in full combat gear, not in a straight line but weaving as he went, shouting to keep himself moving. The American covering fire suppressed most of the German defenders. Drabik crossed without being hit. Second Lieutenant Timmerman followed within seconds, the first American officer to cross the Rhine. Both men received the Distinguished Service Cross. By 5:30 that afternoon, both Captain Bracci and Captain Friesenhahn had surrendered in the railway tunnel on the eastern bank. Major Scheller escaped through the rear of the tunnel on a bicycle and filed his written report to Corps headquarters. The Rhine bridge at Remagen was in American hands. The news reached Adolf Hitler that evening. His reaction was sustained fury. Within hours he had already decided who would answer for what had happened. On the American side, General Omar Bradley received the call from First Army Commander General Courtney Hodges, and by his own account, shouted the loudest single phrase of his military career. Bradley then called Eisenhower, who was at dinner. Eisenhower's response was immediate. "Hold it. Get across with everything you have. Keep that bridgehead." Eisenhower later wrote that when he heard the Rhine bridge was intact in American hands, the final defeat of Germany, which he had calculated would come in the summer or autumn of 1945, seemed suddenly not distant at all. In that telephone call, the timeline of the war in Europe shifted. The morning after the bridge was taken, American engineers received the order that would define the following 2 weeks. The Ludendorff Bridge was damaged and structurally uncertain. Everyone from Eisenhower down understood it might collapse at any moment. The mission was to build additional bridges across the Rhine as fast as possible, under fire, so that the loss of the captured span would not stop the flow of men and equipment into the bridgehead. What happened over the following days was something German officers would spend years trying to explain. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin commanded the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. His men had spent the previous winter in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, demolishing bridges ahead of the 1st SS Panzer Corps to slow the German advance. Now they had the opposite assignment. They had rehearsed river crossing operations on the Meuse River under simulated combat conditions, using artificial moonlight generators and chemical smoke screens designed to replicate the environment of a contested Rhine crossing. The M2 steel treadway bridge was the American Army's standard tactical floating crossing system. Each complete set provided up to 864 feet of floating span. The structure rested on inflatable rubber pneumatic floats, each 33 feet long with 12 separate airtight compartments, so that a breach in any one section would not sink the adjacent panels. Steel treadway panels connected the floats across the top, wide enough for vehicle traffic and rated to carry medium tanks up to 40 tons. All components arrived on 2.5-ton trucks, 25 vehicles per complete set. The rubber floats were inflated from compressed air tanks mounted on the bridge erection vehicles. Every step of the process had been documented in technical manuals, practiced in training exercises, and drilled until the men could execute it in darkness under fire without supervision. Pergrin's engineers began at 08:30 on March 9, 1945, extending the span eastward across the current from the Remagen bank toward Erpel. German artillery observers on the high ground above the eastern bank had a clear sightline to the construction site throughout. Shells began falling within the first hour. A direct hit at around 1300 hours killed 1 engineer and wounded 5 more. After midnight, German tank guns on the eastern bank fired directly at the leading end of the growing span. That forward end of the structure, where the men worked closest to the enemy guns, was called Suicide Point by the engineers assigned there. The work continued. The engineers who built these bridges under fire were not anonymous. They had names and hometowns, and they had trained for this specific moment for months. When Pergrin's men started work that morning, they knew exactly what they were building, and exactly what each component weighed, and how it connected to the next. They had done it in the dark on the Meuse River in Belgium in winter conditions, with instructors stopping the clock and pointing out errors. They had memorized load ratings, anchor configurations, and the exact procedure for inflating a pneumatic float in the dark. When the shells started falling, they did not stop to recalculate. They had already done all the thinking they needed to do. The only question that remained was whether they would finish before the artillery found them. Most of the time, they did. At 17:10 on March 10, 1945, the bridge reached the eastern bank and was open to traffic. It measured approximately 1,100 feet in length. It had been built in roughly 32.5 hours of continuous work under artillery and direct fire, across a fast current in early spring. It was the longest tactical treadway bridge ever assembled under enemy fire to that point in the history of the war. The forward end of the growing bridge, the section being pushed out across the current toward the enemy-held bank, was under direct observation from German positions on the Oppenheim cliff throughout. Every engineer working that section knew it. They kept working there anyway, in rotating shifts, in the dark, with artillery falling around them, because the alternative was a bridge that stopped in the middle of the river. The men working Suicide Point were not performing heroism in any theatrical sense. They were performing a technical procedure they had been trained to execute under exactly these conditions. That, more than anything, is what the German High Command could not replicate by the spring of 1945. They had lost the time, the resources, and the industrial base needed to produce that kind of preparation at that scale. The 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser, completed a heavy pontoon bridge between Kripp and Linz, upstream from the treadway, on March 11th. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion received orders to build a floating Bailey Bridge downstream on March 18th. Beginning work at 07:30 that morning and completing the span in approximately 48 hours, making it the first American Bailey Bridge across the Rhine. Together, the three structures created a crossing capacity at Remagen that the German High Command had considered impossible to establish under the defensive conditions there. The German response was an effort that called on every remaining resource of the Reich. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 367 combat sorties against the bridge complex in the 9 days following the capture. Among the aircraft used were Arado AR-234 jets, among the first jet-powered bombers used operationally in the history of aviation. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter also participated in the attacks. None of the sorties succeeded in destroying or significantly damaging the bridges. American anti-aircraft units at Remagen grew into what the United States Army's official history later described as probably the most intensive concentration of anti-aircraft weapons anywhere in the European theater during the entire war. 16 batteries of 90mm guns and 25 batteries of automatic weapons covered both banks. American anti-aircraft crews claimed an estimated 109 of the attacking aircraft destroyed or probably destroyed. 7 naval commando frogmen trained under the direction of German Special Operations Commander Otto Skorzeny attempted to float downstream on the night of March 17th, wearing Italian underwater breathing apparatus and carrying demolition charges intended for the bridge supports. The water temperature was 7 degrees Celsius. Crews of the 738th Tank Battalion detected the swimmers using the canal defense light, a secret device producing 13 million candle power of illumination mounted in the turrets of modified M3 tank hulls, used in combat for the first time at Remagen. All 7 frogmen were killed or captured before reaching the bridges. 11 V-2 ballistic missiles were fired at the Remagen bridgehead from launch sites near Hellendoorn in the Netherlands. This was the only operational use of the V-2 against a tactical battlefield target during the entire Second World War. The missiles killed American soldiers and civilians in Remagen and the surrounding area, including 3 men at the command post of the 284th Engineer Combat Battalion. Not one of the 11 struck the bridges. The 600mm Karl self-propelled siege mortar, firing shells weighing over 2 tons, was also deployed against the bridgehead. It also failed. Every method of destruction that Germany could bring to bear had been attempted. None had worked. Hitler had not waited to see the results before acting against those he held responsible for the loss of the bridge. He dismissed Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10th and replaced him with Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, summoned from Italy. Kesselring arrived at Western headquarters and later described commanding what he had inherited as playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. He called the events at Remagen the crime of Remagen, and wrote in his post-war memoir that it broke the front along the Rhine. He told his staff on arrival that the German military situation had become nearly catastrophic. The news that Remagen had fallen spread through German Army Group B within hours. Field Marshal Model, whose army group was responsible for the entire sector, received the report and immediately recognized the implications. There was no prepared reserve to throw against a bridgehead on the eastern bank. The formations that existed were scattered, depleted, and short of fuel. Model ordered what could be assembled to counterattack, but he already understood that the Rhine, which every German officer had counted on as the one element that could not be taken quickly, had been lost in the space of an afternoon by a few dozen soldiers and an insufficient amount of the wrong explosive. The psychological effect on the German command ran deeper than the tactical loss itself. If the Rhine could fall this way, then there was no position, no river, and no terrain feature that could substitute for the industrial and logistical capacity that Germany had already lost. Hitler also established the Flying Special Court-Martial West under Generalleutnant Rudolf Hübner. Within 72 hours of its creation, 4 German officers had been tried, convicted, and executed with a single shot to the back of the neck in the Westerwald region, 2 near Rimbach and 2 near Oberirsen. Major Hans Scheller, who had arrived at the Remagen Bridge barely 2 hours before the American assault, was executed. Major August Kraft, commander of the Engineer Battalion responsible for Rhine Bridge demolitions in the sector, was executed. Major Herbert Strobel, Kraft's regimental commander, was executed. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, whose rocket battery at the bridge had contributed to confusion over demolition timing in the final minutes, was executed. They were taken to nearby woods, shot, and buried where they fell. Their letters home were burned by the executioners. Their families lost military pensions. Captain Friesenhahn, who had set the charges and done everything technically possible with the materials he had actually been given, was acquitted in absentia. He was already in an American prisoner of war facility. Captain Bratji was sentenced to death in absentia. He was also in American custody. General Major Richard von Bothmer, condemned separately for the fall of Bonn, was a widower whose only son had been killed in the war. During his court proceedings on March 10th, he seized a pistol from a court official and shot himself in the courtroom. He was 48 years old. Kesselring and Model published the executions in a formal order of the day sent to every formation in the West on March 18th. The text demanded the sharpest action and greatest severity from all courts-martial going forward. The intended effect was to stiffen resistance by making failure more dangerous than the enemy. The actual effect, documented in multiple post-war interrogations, was the opposite. German engineers began demolishing bridges before they had authorization to do so, including bridges their own forces still needed for movement and supply. The correction had made everything worse. Joseph Goebbels recorded the German internal response in his diary. His mid-March entries described the Remagen situation as quite devastating and predicted that from such a small beginning, a running sore would develop, the poison from which would spread to the Reich's vitals. On March 24th, he opened his diary entry with the words, "The situation in the West has entered an extraordinarily critical, ostensibly almost deadly, phase." Field Marshal Walter Model's counterattack at Remagen assembled the remnants of 4 armoured formations, Panzer Lehr, the 9th Panzer Division, the 11th Panzer Division, and the 106th Panzer Brigade. Together they fielded approximately 60 tanks and 12,000 men. The 11th Panzer Division could not move at all for 3 days because it had no fuel. The counterattack failed. Model's Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagener, testified after the war for the United States Army Historical Division that Remagen should have been considered a basis for termination of the war, describing it as a dangerous abscess in the last German defences and an ideal springboard for the offensive to come. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, interrogated after the German surrender, told American officers that the capture of the Remagen Bridge had made a long defence impossible. While the fight around Remagen continued, American engineers were preparing to cross the Rhine at multiple points simultaneously, hundreds of kilometres apart. General George Patton had been racing the Third Army through the Saar-Palatinate region throughout early March and received authorization on March 19th to take the Rhine on the run if a crossing presented itself. The 12th Corps identified Oppenheim and Nierstein as viable locations roughly 30 kilometres south of Mainz. The German defences in that sector were thin, exhausted, and without armoured support. The assault crossing began at 2200 hours on March 22, 1945. The troops were from the 11th Infantry Regiment of the 5th Infantry Division, veterans of 22 previous river crossings since Normandy. They crossed in assault boats operated by the 204th Engineer Battalion, 3 battalions of infantry landing simultaneously at Nierstein and Oppenheim. The first wave reached the eastern bank with almost no resistance. American casualties in the initial crossing totaled approximately 28 men. Roughly 19,000 German soldiers surrendered to Third Army in the first 48 hours. Patton called General Bradley the following morning. He said, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." When Montgomery's assault on the lower Rhine was only 24 hours away, Patton called again. He said, "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." The pontoon bridge at Nierstein, built by the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, stretched 366 metres across the Rhine and was completed in 18 hours. The American Army Technical Manual estimated 5.5 hours for a section of 362 feet under ideal daylight conditions. The 249th had built a bridge nearly twice that length in 18 hours, while simultaneously supporting a combat operation on both banks in darkness. The fastest American Rhine crossing of the campaign came the following morning, March 24, 1945, on the lower Rhine south of the city of Wesel, as part of the largest set-piece river crossing in military history to that point. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Plunder had been planned for months on a scale that dwarfed anything previously attempted in the Western campaign. Over 1.2 million men were involved across the full Allied force. More than 250,000 tons of supplies had been prepositioned. A 66-mile chemical smokescreen had been maintained for 8 days before the assault to conceal the build-up from German observers. Over 3,500 artillery pieces were ready for the opening bombardment. More than 37,000 British and 22,000 American engineers were committed specifically to bridging and assault crossing support. The entire German Army, Group B, expected to defend against this force, could field approximately 60 tanks and 12,000 men. The artillery preparation began at 1700 hours on March 23. The 51st Highland Infantry Division crossed near Rhys at 2100 hours. The 15th Scottish Infantry Division followed before dawn on March 24. British commandos took Wesel, which had been reduced to rubble by bombing. At 1000 hours on March 24, the 6th British Airborne Division and the 17th United States Airborne Division landed east of Wesel in Operation Varsity. Approximately 16,000 to 17,000 airborne troops were carried to the combat zone by roughly 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,300 gliders, escorted by thousands of fighters. It was the largest single-day airborne operation in history. The American Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, crossed south of Wesel under a bombardment of over 65,000 artillery shells fired in a single hour from 2,000 guns. American casualties in the first 2 hours numbered 31 men. The 17th Armored Engineer Battalion began constructing an M2 treadway bridge, approximately 5 kilometers south of Wesel, at 0945, on March 24, 1945. Companies E and C, with Company C of the 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion attached, worked under the command of Captain James McAdams. German artillery was falling on the construction site throughout the day. At 1600 hours that afternoon, the first vehicle rolled across. The bridge measured 1,152 feet, supported by 93 inflated rubber pontoons, and had been built in 6 hours and 15 minutes. The technical manual allocated 5.5 hours for 362 feet of treadway under ideal daylight conditions. The 17th Armored Engineers had laid more than 3 times that length in barely more time, under direct fire, across one of the largest rivers in Central Europe. Lieutenant William Doyle told a war correspondent 2 days after the crossing, "I guess we just were scared and wanted to get out of here in a hurry." The record held for the remainder of the war in Europe. To appreciate what these numbers meant in practice, consider what doctrine had established as achievable. A 362-foot section, 5.5 hours, good conditions, no enemy fire. The 291st built approximately 1,100 feet in 32.5 hours under continuous shell fire. The 249th built 366 meters in 18 hours during a night assault. The 17th Armored Engineers built 1,152 feet in 6 hours and 15 minutes under artillery attack. Every one of these outcomes exceeded what doctrine considered achievable under realistic combat conditions. The Germans had no answer for it, because they had no equivalent system, no equivalent equipment, and no equivalent supply chain to bring any of it to the river. Across the full Rhine front in the final weeks of March, American and British engineers built bridges at a pace German intelligence could barely document. The 148th Engineer Combat Battalion completed the first American Bailey Bridge across the Rhine around March 20th. The 1139th Engineer Combat Group built its treadway at Mainz on March 25th, the longest tactical bridge laid in the entire European theatre. The 85th Engineer Heavy Pontoon Battalion completed its bridge at Worms on March 25th and 26th, supporting the 4th Infantry Division's crossing. The reason for all of it lay in decisions made years earlier and an ocean away. By 1945, the United States was producing more than half of all industrial goods manufactured anywhere in the world. American military production had risen from roughly 2% of the national economy before the war to 40% by 1943. The factories producing rubber compounds for the pneumatic pontoons, aluminum alloys for the heavy pontoon systems, structural steel for the Bailey trusses, and the 2.5-ton trucks that carried everything to the riverbank ran without interruption, beyond the reach of German bombers, sustained by continental resources and a labor force organized for wartime production on a scale nothing in German planning had anticipated. A single M2 bridge set required 25 2.5-ton trucks to move its components to a riverbank. The American logistics system had tens of thousands of those trucks running day and night. When General Bayerlein was ordered to mount a counterattack at Remagen, his 11th Panzer Division sat stationary for 3 days because it had no fuel at all. American engineer companies found their bridge sets waiting for them in organized depots, placed there months in advance, specifically for the Rhine crossing operation. The human preparation matched the material. Pergrin's 291st had rehearsed bridging on the Meuse under simulated combat conditions. The 17th Armored Engineers had built practice bridges across the Meuse twice before reaching the Rhine. The doctrine was written in technical manuals the men carried in the field. When the moment came, there was nothing to improvise. There was only execution of a plan that had been made, tested, corrected, and practiced until it ran by instinct. German pioneer battalions in 1945 had none of this. They lacked the bridging equipment, the truck fleet to move it, the supply chain to sustain it, and the training time to prepare for it. They operated under a command system that had just executed 4 officers for a demolition failure caused by inadequate explosives that the executed men had not chosen. Those executions produced not better engineers but more frightened ones. Frightened engineers blow bridges before their own side has finished using them, which is exactly what happened in the weeks after the executions in the Westerwald. The terror of the court-martial had accelerated the defensive collapse it was intended to prevent. The Ludendorff Bridge itself fell at approximately 1500 hours on March 17, 1945. Riveting joints in the upstream truss gave way audibly under the accumulated stress of 10 days of heavy traffic and the underlying structural damage from the failed German demolition charge of March 7th. The central span collapsed into the Rhine. Approximately 28 American soldiers were killed and over 60 were injured. The 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, which had been working on the structural repairs, suffered the heaviest losses. Its executive officer, 2 company commanders, 3 platoon leaders, and 6 platoon sergeants were among the dead and missing. By the time the bridge fell, 6 American divisions and approximately 125,000 troops had already crossed the Rhine through the Remagen bridgehead. 2 other bridges were carrying continuous traffic. The bridgehead was 25 miles wide and 8 miles deep. The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge, so long feared by the Americans and so desperately sought by the Germans, was strategically without consequence the moment it occurred. What followed unfolded with the logic of a campaign that had already been decided. On March 25th, First Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead into central Germany, spearheaded by the 3rd Armored Division. 9th Army broke out from the Plunder bridgehead to the north. On April 1st, 1945, the 2 forces met near the town of Lippstadt. The encirclement of Army Group B was complete. Field Marshal Model's command was sealed inside a pocket centered on the Ruhr industrial region. American intelligence had estimated the pocket contained approximately 100,000 German soldiers. When the surrender was processed, the count was 317,000 troops, making the Ruhr encirclement a larger capitulation than the entire German force lost at Stalingrad. By April of 1945, Allied bombing had already crippled Ruhr industrial production to a fraction of its pre-war output. The encirclement removed any remaining possibility of organized industrial recovery. Germany could no longer manufacture war at any meaningful scale. The soldiers who surrendered between April 1st and April 18th represented the end of organized German resistance in the West. Field Marshal Model knew what it meant. He dissolved Army Group B on April 17th rather than sign a surrender document, and ordered his men to disperse individually. That same day he told his Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagner, a question and then answered it himself. What is left for a defeated general? In ancient times they took poison. 4 days later, on April 21st, 1945, Model walked alone into a wooded area between Duisburg and the village of Lintorf, today part of the city of Ratingen, and shot himself with his pistol. He was 54 years old. The last military bridge built across the Rhine by Allied forces in Europe was completed on May 8, 1945, by the 332nd Engineer General Service Regiment. May 8th was the day Germany surrendered. The war that American planners had estimated would last into the summer or autumn of 1945 had ended in 8 weeks from the day Timmerman and Drabik first set foot on the eastern bank at Remagen. A sign had been painted on planking by Paul Priest, an infantryman with the 9th Armored Division's reconnaissance group, and mounted at the bridge in the days after its capture. It read, "Cross the Rhine with dry feet, courtesy of the 9th Armored Division." The sign passed into the history of the campaign as one of the few moments of clear, uncomplicated satisfaction in a war that rarely offered them. What German officers from Kesselring to Wagner to Goebbels all recognized in those 3 weeks of March and early April of 1945 was not primarily a military defeat in the tactical sense. It was a verdict on the nature of the war itself. The Rhine had represented Germany's last calculable advantage, a geographical feature so formidable that even an army stripped of most of its armor and most of its fuel might use it to buy time. The American bridges ended that possibility with a speed and completeness that left no room for reinterpretation. Kesselring described commanding what remained of the Western defenses as playing a Beethoven sonata on an old, rickety, out-of-tune piano. He was not being poetic. He meant that the instrument itself was broken, and that skill, however genuine, cannot compensate for the absence of the materials that skill requires to function. The American engineer battalions had everything their doctrine required: trained men, prepositioned equipment, an unbroken supply chain, and months of rehearsal. German pioneer units in March of 1945 had none of those things, and a court-martial system that had just killed 4 officers for trying to work with what they were given. The bridges at Remagen and Wesel and Nierstein were not the product of improvisation or battlefield inspiration. They were the product of years of deliberate preparation by a country that had decided, early in the war, to build an army that could execute at the standard its enemies could not match. The men who built them came from every part of American life: farmers from Ohio who understood work in difficult conditions, mechanics from Michigan who could diagnose a problem by sound, carpenters from Georgia who understood how load transfers through a structure, Steel workers from Pennsylvania, who had spent years working with the same materials they now laid across a German river under fire. They were not extraordinary in any dramatic sense. They were skilled workers in uniform, backed by the most productive industrial economy in the history of organized warfare, executing procedures they had been taught and drilled until execution required no conscious thought. That combination ended the war in the West. Not any single act of courage, though there were hundreds. Not any single bridge, though each one mattered. The combination of trained men, proven doctrine, sufficient equipment, and an uninterrupted supply chain was what every German officer, watching an American engineer company lay a treadway bridge across the Rhine in an afternoon already understood could not be countered, not by execution orders. Not by jet bombers, not by ballistic missiles or underwater swimmers or 600mm siege weapons, not by anything Germany still possessed in March of 1945. The men of the 291st, the 17th Armored Engineers, the 249th, and the dozens of other engineer units who built bridges across the Rhine in March of 1945 did not think of themselves as making history. They were executing a job. They checked their components against their manuals, inflated the floats, bolted the treadways, pushed the span forward, and kept working when artillery fell around them, because stopping was not an option they had been trained to consider. When the work was done, when the first tanks rolled across and the traffic began to build, they moved on to the next assignment. The sign at Remagen said it plainly enough: dry feet, courtesy of the 9th Armored Division. There was nothing in those 8 words about sacrifice or triumph or the weight of history. There was only the completed job. That restraint was itself part of what the German High Command could not match. It takes a particular kind of preparation to perform under those conditions with that kind of matter-of-fact efficiency. The Germans, watching from the eastern bank, had every opportunity to admire it. They also had every reason to understand exactly what it meant. The bridges carried the army across. The army sealed the pocket. The pocket ended Army Group B. And the war that had begun with Germany's armies moving faster than anyone thought possible across Europe ended with American engineers building bridges faster than anyone thought possible across the last river Germany had left. Defend.